Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time sorcerer of the Aethers, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss mysticism, religion, the occult, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a very uplifting, positive, lovely topic. I'm kidding. We're talking about like the opposite of that. We're talking about the idea of divine punishment, and the idea that your actions could get you spiritual consequences. This video is going to encompass ideas like hell, karma, all those fun, lovely, uplifting things. And this will also be the start of a new series on this channel that I'm calling the Severity series. And it will be exploring the sort of heavier and darker side of the esoteric that very few esoterically oriented creators talk about. A lot of exoteric religion creators discuss this stuff, but so few people approach it from an esoteric angle that I thought it would be worthy of discussing. Because while we may be sort of familiar with these concepts, are we really familiar with them on a deeper esoteric level, or are we more familiar with them from what we were told as a kid? And for that reason, we are starting with one of the most kind of terrifying ideas in all of religion, that you can be punished by divinity. So the first way that I want to talk about this is through the idea of karma, because I think karma is a concept that in the West, I'm a Westerner, so obviously I'm coming from that angle, we have really watered down and reduced to an explanation that I don't quite think is actually what it originally meant. So here in the West, the general idea of karma is I do bad thing, so in a couple months, maybe a year or so, bad thing will happen to me. And while that kind of idea does exist in some traditions, karma is actually a lot more complex. I think also a lot of people who are neo-pagans, pagans really misunderstand karma because they've been exposed to this idea called the rule of three, which really comes from Wicca, but it doesn't even actually come from Wicca. The rule of three is the idea that what you do comes back on you times three, whether that is good or bad. And the thing is, this actually was not from any of the writings of Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca. It actually comes from a later writer, Dorian Valiente, who wrote this as a giant poem. But all that got remembered was that last bit, right? What you do comes back times three. And once again, people applied this to, if I do this, a few weeks later, this will happen to me. Whereas the original idea of karma, if you look to the East, is that over your life, you sort of accumulate karma. And then that actually determines what you are reincarnated into and what your next life looks like. Reincarnation is an idea that exists in many places. And fundamentally what it is the idea that we come back. But reincarnation does not necessarily mean that you're going to be reincarnated as a human. You could come back as a bug or a dog or something like that, and that would reflect your previous life. However, reincarnation is not an endless cycle. Often it's drawn in this diagram known as the samsara diagram, which is essentially this like wheel, right? But what's interesting is you can actually break out of samsara if you live a sort of good enough life, if your karma is good enough, and then you sort of break out of this and unite with divinity again, and you are freed from this endless cycle, this cycle of life, death, and rebirth, because fundamentally that is a recurring theme in all of religion. You live, you die, and you are reborn. This is the endless, perennial cycle of everything. It happens within our actual lives, but it also happens on a much larger scale with our whole of life. Whether you believe actually in a life after death or you believe we are reincarnated, you are being reborn, right? Because even if you believe in some sort of afterlife, you are reborn into that new location. And that brings us to the sort of other idea about divine punishment that I think people in the West are the most familiar with, and that'll be the idea of hell. So hell is an idea that terrifies the living daylight out of so many people, to the extent where it can kind of hold them back and kind of orient their entire spirituality around this fear of going to hell. And it reminds me of this really interesting Sufi poem. I'm gonna botch it, I don't have it memorized. It essentially said, if I love, well, they would say Allah, but if I love divinity out of fear of punishment in hell, send me to hell. If I love Allah, God, divinity, out of a desire to enjoy the fruits of paradise, may I never get within, I think it was about 500 years of that. But if I love God, Allah, divinity for the sake of that, then may I experience paradise, which I really like. Because it's true. If your entire spiritual practice is oriented around, I don't want to suffer, I don't want to be given hell, I don't think that is love for divinity at all. That is worshiping divinity out of fear and out of being, forced to. That's not love. That is very much like being held hostage. Whereas if you actually love divinity for the beauty of this world, the virtues of this world, that is a very different view. And that I find a lot more honorable, and that is closer to what us mystics are about. If you become a mystic, there's a really good quote, mysticism is the child of discipline and devotion, and nowhere in there is this fear. Now, out of sort of a understanding of the strength of divinity, it is reasonable to know that they could theoretically cause harm. And that is like a reality, right? These divinities, these gods, these spirits, they are higher than us. They are higher on the chain of emanation. They are above us. So of course they can cause, some very horrific things if they desire to. But that is why we should revere them, because this is the thing about severity. Severity is necessary. We need both the push and pull of the universe for things to make sense. There needs to be balance. Nothing can be complete without its opposites. These rules, these laws are sort of the foundations of our universe and are necessary. So the sort of righteous anger of divinity, that has a place, that has a necessity. Now, another perspective about hell, now that I get into like what hell is, what is this belief, and is it just a belief in Christianity? There is a sort of alternative perspective around hell that has been sort of emerging recently, which is the idea that hell is not necessarily a literal place, but hell is simply being detached from divinity, right? Heaven or paradise, whatever you want to call it, is when you are united with the divine, whereas hell is when you are detached to it. It's simply like this cold place of detachment, and it's truly what death is. It is the end, because you are no longer being nourished by that power, that beauty that is the divine. It is that complete separation and loss of everything, which I think is an interesting perspective and is certainly a more mystical way of explaining things. Now, let's get into the Christian idea of hell. It's the one everyone's familiar with. Over your life, you sort of, you have works and faith, and depending on, how good that goes, there's this day of judgment and you go to heaven, which is great. You're with God, you're reunited with all that, or hell, it's like eternal damnation and punishment, right? But that's not the only tradition with this idea. They didn't actually come up with this either. And it exists in many places. The next one, and this is how we're going to sort of tangent onto what the idea comes from, it's actually Islam. So Islam has a kind of similar idea, sort of, where you either go to paradise or you go to hell, right? You go to the fires of hell. Though they describe it in a slightly different way. They say that what it is there's essentially this bridge that is like the thickness of a hair that you walk across, and based on your sort of life and how you lived, that will determine whether or not you can cross it. And it gets thinner or thicker depending on sort of how your life went. And you were also asked these questions about what is your God, what is your religion. You're sort of tested in this way. So it's not like you die and you or either like go to purgatory and wait it out, or you go to hell or whatever. You're kind of like crossing this line. Also, yes, I did forget purgatory. Let me circle back to that. So some Christians, specifically Catholics, have this idea that before you go to heaven, you go to a state called purgatory, which is where you're sort of in these purgative fires to pull off your sins and pull off your transgressions before you eventually go to heaven and are reunited with God. Anyways, back to the bridge. So this bridge actually did not originate with Islam at all, but it is deeply wound in there. You don't see this idea in the other Abrahamic religions. All of them view sort of this idea differently, but Islam has a very different perspective. And if you look in other religions from that region, you will notice that Zoroastrianism also believes in this bridge. They believe in this idea that you cross and fall. And Zoroastrianism kind of has an interesting role in this sort of world of religions, because it kind of was the first monotheistic religion, and it did sort of, in some ways, lay a few of the foundations for the big three monotheistic religions. But also it is very different from them. It's not part of the lineage of Abraham. It has a very different feeling to it. And it's interesting. I would not call it pagan. I don't like when people call Zoroastrianism pagan. It is very different from the other monotheistic religions and kind of hard to put in the exact same category, which is why when I say the big monotheistic religions, I'm typically referring to the Abrahamic three religions that everyone thinks of, right? Of course, you can go further with that and add like the Baha'i and the Druze, but we're not going to get into that. There's a lot of them. There are a lot of religions out there. Anyways, Zoroastrianism has this bridge idea. And I think a lot of people, when they find that out, are actually really surprised because, one, it does show that Islam has some pre-Abrahamic roots, but also that, wait, I thought this hell idea was some Abrahamic idea. I thought only the Abrahamics believed that. No, actually. Interestingly, even though I would say a lot of the modern neo-pagan space kind of does argue for reincarnation, a lot of the pagan religions actually don't believe in reincarnation. I think that the modern pagan space's sort of connection to the idea of reincarnation comes from kind of two places. I would say part of it is that the modern pagan space does have kind of a perennialist bent to it. Perennialism, in its short form, is the idea that every religion around the world is sort of tapping into this deep inner tradition, this sacred inner truth that has existed since the beginning of time and is eternal. I think there's a lot of that going on in the modern pagan community, and I think the other way that this might have come in is that modern pagan movements are highly informed by the Victorian occult revival. The Victorian occult revival is a period in the Edwardian and Victorian era, specifically in England, but it also expanded across parts of Europe, where people were very interested in the spiritual, and this sort of filtered out into the US with the spiritualism movement. People really wanted to revive this stuff, and this is where a lot of pagan movements sort of spurred, and a lot of the sort of traditions that led to the modern pagan movement kind of emerged. And a lot of them were essentially trying to syncretize all these religions together to create like the master religion. The method of science, the aim of religion, the highest form of religion is truth. Ideas like thelema, hermeticism, theosophy, they all come from this period. And those did a lot of blending the East and the West together that you didn't really see previously in discussion of these spiritualities. So I think that is also a factor in it. But I do want to recognize that a lot of neo-pagans do believe in reincarnation, and there are some pagan traditions that do sort of seem to lead to that conclusion as well. But there are pagan traditions that have a definite afterlife. Now, an interesting perspective from some of them is that if you have a patron, which is a singular god within the pagan system that you follow, that you are particularly devoted to, you would reunite with that patron. So sort of like this idea of uniting with God, uniting with divinity that we see both in Escaping Samsara and in this heaven idea, it is kind of that, right? You come back to who you honor. But that's not every system. I want to talk specifically about the Nordic system. I very rarely talk about Nordic paganism. I'm not a Nordic pagan. I don't feel a lot of connection to that tradition. But I think this is one where people have really kind of reduced things down, and specifically around Valhalla. So an idea within Nordic paganism is that if you die a warrior's death, you go to Valhalla, which I think many people believe is basically just Viking heaven. Like, I've seen a lot of discussions where people think if you're a Nordic pagan and you die in any fashion, you're gonna go to Valhalla. That's not actually correct. That doesn't make sense at all. Valhalla is only for those who die a warrior death, whereas sort of joining the halls of Freya, which is this sort of afterlife with her, where it's these kind of decadent, romantic places, or going to Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel of death. Interestingly, we're seeing that term emerge before Christianity. I think that's something you should hold on to because, interestingly, both Judaism and Islam actually use a different term for that place. Just letting you know, it'd be Gehenna or Jehannam. But Helheim is this kind of afterlife. But unlike the traditions of Christianity and Islam, it's less of a punishment and more of a place that most souls go. It's kind of like the average afterlife. And you actually see a very similar idea in Hellenic, Greek, and Roman forms of paganism as well, where there are, once again, different afterlives depending on what you did in your life, who you honored, and what happened. So actually, there may not only be one destination. Mormonism, funnily enough, I don't think I've ever talked about them, but Mormonism is a break-off Christian tradition that sort of is based off this guy, Joseph Smith, who, by the way, was an occultist. He actually died with a Pentacle of Solomon in his pocket, which anyone who's familiar with the grimoire occult traditions will know what that is from, which is just wild. He also used to use some kind of Masonic gestures in his rituals, which I find a little interesting, but regardless, he believed that there were multiple heavens, and there were sort of layers to heaven. There was not one heaven, and depending how good your life was, how good of a Mormon you are, you will go to a different layer of heaven after you die. So once again, it's this kind of idea that there's more than one afterlife. It depends on what you did. Now, I want to go kind of away from death. We spent a lot of time talking about death, to within this life divine punishment, because there is this idea that if you do something really bad, you can be punished while alive. And this is something that I think people, when they talk about, used to kind of demonize polytheistic and pagan religions, with the idea that the pagan gods are these horrible, wrathful gods who want to destroy everything. They're awful, they're evil. That is a complete lie. The pagan gods are both sides of severity and mercy. They are both, because balance is everything. These gods contain amazing virtues and have given so many gifts to humanity in their myths, their lore, and their religions. But they also had this form of severity. And interestingly enough, the Abrahamic religions are not exempt from this idea either. In the Old Testament, there is God who sends this flood. He kills a lot of people because they have done something that is such a spiritual transgression that it is worthy of this extreme punishment. And in Islam, a couple of the names of Allah, because they believe there are 99 names of Allah, are pretty severe. The most extreme and the one that I find the most interesting is Al-Mumit, which basically means the bringer of death. So there is severity and mercy in all of these gods in both the pagan world and the Abrahamic world. And I want to be clear, severity is not evil. I am not saying that there is no metaphysical evil. That will actually be explored later on in the series. Metaphysical evil is real. And there always are kind of spiritual conflicts between different forces going on at any given time. But severity is not that. Severity is righteous anger, anger that is necessary to keep things in line. That is not evil. Evil is something else entirely, which I would like to discuss in the future, and I certainly will discuss in the future. Now, I've been using the term transgress. The thing is, transgression can mean a lot of different things, and it is kind of a spiritually loaded word. So there are a number of spiritual traditions, specifically those that would be in the east part of the original left-hand path, and stuff that is part of the left-hand path in the west, that really base their spirituality around transgression, understanding that there is sort of divinity even in the filth, or by doing acts that are seen as transgressive, there's actually a sort of spiritual power that comes from that. And that is true. But what that raises the question of is, what is a transgression? When is a transgression a spiritually beneficial thing to do? And when is it something that might get you divinely punished and cause actual consequences for you? Because there is a difference there. No spiritual tradition that is, I would hope anyone follows and is respectable, will be advocating for something that is truly metaphysically evil. But instead, they advocate for experimenting with various taboos to understand the metaphysical meaning of them. Or in one case, like laying down in a grave. There's one tradition that has you like lay in a grave and really reflect on death, and that is transgressive. That is something that to a lot of people would make them very metaphysically uncomfortable. But that reminds you that even when you are dying, there is divinity in that. Or even looking at Christianity, the tradition that we see is the least transgressive in the West, there is a whole practice that mystics were doing where they would meditate on being essentially suffering in hell, or meditate on being hurt in the way that Jesus was on the cross. That is deeply transgressive, and funnily enough, you could argue even kind of left-hand path, but that is not seen as metaphysically evil. And so what it is it raises that question. What is transgression? What is metaphysically evil? Because in our practices, we should not be focusing exclusively on love and light. We should know that there are mysteries on this sort of other side of things. And if you have a love and light only practice, that will leave you deeply spiritually unbalanced. We need to experience both sides of this polarity to achieve a state of balance, growth, and spiritual perfection. Because what is the core secret of a lot of mysteries, specifically in accordance to Thelema? And this is one of the Thelemic ideas that I actually still cling to. And that is the unification of opposites. When you bring these opposites together, they come together and they create the magical child, masculine, feminine child, all of these things. That is a sacred and powerful formula that will always hold deep spiritual power. So think about this stuff. Think about your beliefs on it, and think about what might be worthy of divine punishment and what you're doing in your life so that you can improve, become more virtuous, discover your true will, and accomplish the great work. I know this stuff is hard to think about, scary, and has a lot of baggage for a lot of people, but it is worth considering. And so that's all I think I want to say today. I am Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. If you want to support this channel, please join my Patreon. You get an extra video every month, all these videos early. You get my ritual guides, which are rituals that I write for you to perform. And you also get access to my Telegram group chat. And if you're a high enough tier, you can meet with me once a month for spiritual consultations and mentoring, which I love the people that I do that with. It's so fun. So definitely check it out. I'm also on every social media platform under the sun. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, TikTok. I don't know where I'm not. I'm on Substack as well. I always forget about my Substack. I also host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, which you can actually listen to at your convenience on this channel. It's literally on this channel, so you don't even have to leave. But it is also on every podcasting platform, excluding Apple Podcast. I don't like Apple Podcasts, so it's not there. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you subscribe for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel, and you will never need to think about divine punishment again. You'll literally be exempt. It's like a get out of jail free card in Monopoly. All right, bye.